The climate change scammers are everywhere, demanding reparations from the West. The biggest scammer of all is Pakistan. See why Pakistan's floods are not caused by climate change today on The 10th Man. There was a disastrous flood in Pakistan in 2022, even worse than the disaster of 2010. The news media are now claiming every natural disaster is a product of climate change and says the United States should pay the damage. Let's take a look, focusing on Pakistan, and ask whether they are victims of climate disaster or if Pakistan is just a disaster of a country. 1/3 of Pakistan was underwater in the 2022 monsoon season. Around 30 million people were affected. The monsoon rains started early and ended late, and some scientists claim the rains were 5 times as intense as the average. Homes were destroyed, people were displaced, fields were flooded, and crops failed. Pakistan's rivers originating high in the Himalayas were flooded in part by melting glaciers. These events, combined with record-high temperatures, amount to a climate disaster, or so they say. A climate disaster caused by us because Western countries, not Pakistan, caused this climate change disaster. Climate change theory itself is controversial because the climate change movement continues to present weather disasters as climate disasters. There is enough hyperbole and distortion to condemn this climate change religion to failure, even if it were true. Pakistan's flooding is a case in point. According to their own Federal Flood Commission, Pakistan has witnessed 28 super riverine floods in its 75-year history, or every 3 years. The first one was in 1950, and the only reason this history goes back no further is because Pakistan did not exist before 1947. Pakistan was created in that year with the partitioning of then India into 2 countries. India was divided in order to create Pakistan as a Muslim state, separate from India, which is predominantly Hindu. As a Muslim state, its creation drove a vast migration of Muslims into its territory. In the process, there was a tremendous amount of violence. While the West looked on unconcerned back in its early history, these lands experienced genocide in Kashmir and famine in Bangladesh. Pakistan is a study in contrasts. With the world's 45th largest economy, it is ranked at 158th in GDP per capita. Pakistan is doing little to advance itself, having one of the most underdeveloped education systems in the world. Barely 60% of the children complete 5th grade. Could it spend more educating its children? Well, it might consider reducing its defense budget. It has the world's 6th largest army, and that army has been utilized. India and Pakistan have been battling continuously since the nation was created, with 4 outright wars and many border skirmishes. Then there's the bomb. Only 9 nations in the world have a nuclear weapons program, and Pakistan is one of them, and nukes are not cheap. There's also population growth. When Pakistan was founded, it had a population of 30 million, which happens to be the same number of people suffering from the floods of 2022. Because of those mass migrations after independence, today the population is over 200 million, the world's 5th largest nation by population. And 40 million of those newcomers, more than the original population, moved to tiny farms right in the Indus River Valley, where all the flooding problems are, and where there are no building standards being followed. Pakistan has a multitude of water problems. It uses river water on its farms, but their distribution system of pipes and canals is one of the least efficient in the world. Excessive leaks and evaporation mean that only a fraction of the water drawn from the rivers ever reaches the fields. To compensate, the farmers have drilled millions of wells to draw upon its groundwater. But groundwater will make the soil salty in this arid region, so fortunately, periodic flooding of the rivers washes away the salt. Pakistan's flooding is not only natural and inevitable, but also necessary. Yet they build houses in the floodplain and then call the floods, considered a blessing in countries like Egypt, a humanitarian disaster, a disaster somehow caused by the West. Now let's look at deforestation. More than 2/3 of the country's population is burning wood for fuel, a practice which is brutal for the environment. There are 160 million people cutting down trees, and that's at least a four-way problem. Trees would slow the runoff into the rivers to a rate they could absorb. Slowing the runoff in turn allows percolation into the ground and replenishment of the sinking water table caused by excessive pumping of groundwater. Trees absorb water through transpiration, letting it evaporate instead of flooding, providing shade and reducing temperatures. And of course, trees absorb carbon. Yet this country is cutting them and burning them at a rate of 27,000 hectares, 70,000 acres a year. And they, unlike Brazil or Canada, don't have a lot of trees to spare. The climate movement is concerned about burning wood only when it's a cyclical wildfire in Canada or one set by power lines in Maui. If they really wanted to do something about climate change, they would have Australia send a shipload of coal to Pakistan and give it away. We would all be better off if they'd burn coal instead of wood because coal is much cleaner. But the climate movement hates coal so much that that will never happen. A shame, because we could easily bring Pakistan into the 19th century first, then work from there. Pakistan is not a climate change victim, it is just mismanaged and in need of some guidance. They already received billions in aid after their disastrous flood in 2010, and they have done little to improve their infrastructure, their policies, or their building practices since then. Compare that to attitudes in the United States. Most of the cities in this country have had a disastrous flood at some time. When it happened, our people did not go to another country with a tin cup. Pakistan is maybe a few years behind us in economic progress, fine. Americans dug the Panama Canal with coal-fired steam shovels, which they invented. The Industrial Revolution, which happened before we were born, built that canal. We then gave it to the world, saving millions of freight miles and preventing the emission of billions of tons of carbon. Someone else want to take a turn? And their so-called climate disaster of 2022 does not compare to our history. Contrast the recent floods to the worst natural disaster in United States history. That was the great Galveston hurricane of 1900. It killed between 8,000 and 12,000 people at a time when the U.S. population was only 76 million. And they won our sympathy for their 2,000 or so deaths out of over 200 million? And what did the people of Galveston do after that, after most of the city was swept away by storm surge? They raised the city of Galveston 17 feet or 4 meters and built a 10-mile-long seawall the same height. They did this using mules and wagons, hand-cut timber, horse-drawn scrapers, and shovels. That effort included elevating more than 2,000 buildings and placing land under them. The people of Galveston issued bonds and paid for it themselves. They did this in 1900. How many floods has Pakistan had since then, and what have they done about it themselves? Pakistan's people are not inferior to Americans, they are just a few years behind. If they are not catching up, it's because of their failed government practices, not climate change. Sending them more money will not fix that problem. The climate change movement needs to stop making excuses for poor government and start treating all people with respect by holding all nations accountable, not just the United States. What Pakistan needs is universal education, elimination of corruption, and investment in infrastructure. Because the best way to prevent flooding is with a shovel, not with a tin cup.